Good evening, dear friends, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Wherever you're listening from tonight, maybe tucked safely under the blankets, curled up in your favorite quiet corner of the house, or perhaps lying somewhere peaceful while the world slowly quiets down outside, I'm so happy you're here with me. Take a slow, gentle breath in. Let your shoulders soften and drop. Maybe pull the blanket or duvet up just a little higher and allow the day to quietly drift away. The London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the telegram. Professor Edmund Blackwood found dead on the Cambridge Express, poisoned in his locked compartment. Scotland Yard saw suicide, but Holmes saw a link. The vial's label mismatched the residue on his lips, one link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The first link. I set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1892, in when thick fog blanketed London and the chill air carried the sharp bite of coal smoke mixed with the damp, muddy scent of the Thames. At 221 B. Baker Street, the sitting room felt close and warm against the bitter cold outside. The coal fire crackled steadily in the grate, sending sparks dancing up the chimney, while the strong, acrid smell of Holmes's shag tobacco hung heavy in the air. My friend sat in his armchair, long legs stretched out, absently plucking at the strings of his Stradivarius violin. The notes were low and mournful, almost lost beneath the patter of rain against the window panes and the distant rumble of hansom cabs on the wet cobbles below. I had just settled with my evening paper. The newsprint, still cool and slightly damp from the newsboy's hands, when a sharp knock sounded at the street door. Mrs. Hudson's quick footsteps climbed the 17 stairs, and she entered, carrying a telegram on a small silver salver, and the faint smell of carbolic soap clung to her apron. "From Inspector Lestrade, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady despite the late hour. Holmes set the violin aside with a soft clatter and tore open the yellow envelope. The paper crisped between his fingers. His eyes gleamed with sudden interest as he read aloud. Professor Edmund Blackwood, found dead in locked first-class compartment on Cambridge Express. Apparent suicide by poison. Vial in hand. Request immediate consultation at King's Cross Morgue. Lestrade. "The game is afoot, Watson," Holmes cried, springing to his feet. He paced rapidly before the fire, the worn carpet muffling his steps. "Locked compartment, poison, suicide, yet Scotland Yard calls me. There is more here than meets the eye." "Data, data, data!" We hurried out into the fog-choked street. The bitter cold nipped at our faces as we hailed a hansom cab. The driver's whip cracked sharply, and the cab jolted forward, their wheels rumbling over slick cobblestones. Inside, the air smelled of wet leather and horse sweat. Holmes drew upon his pipe, the sweetish tobacco smoke curling in the dimness, his steepled fingers resting under his chin as he considered the scant facts. At King's Cross, the station was alive with sound, porters shouting, steam engines hissing, luggage carts clanging on the platform. The air was thick with coal smoke, hot oil, and the underlying rot of river mud. Inspector Lestrade met us near the entrance, his overcoat glistening with moisture, a faint whiff of gunpowder about him from recent practice. "Grim business, Holmes," he said gruffly, leading us down to the temporary morgue. The room was bitterly cold, the air heavy with carbolic disinfectant and the faint, sickly sweetness of death. Professor Blackwood lay on a slab beneath a coarse sheet that felt stiff and starched under my fingers as I lifted it. His face was ashen, lips faintly blue, eyes half open in a glassy stare. A small glass vial remained clutched in his rigid right hand. Holmes bent low, his magnifying glass flashing in the gaslight. He examined the label. Arsenic, pure. then sniffed delicately at the vial's mouth. His nose wrinkled. "The first link, Watson. Observe." He pointed to the residue on the dead man's lips. Fine white crystals, bitter-smelling. "This is not arsenic powder, which is coarser and odorless in small amounts. This has a sharp, almond-like bite, more consistent with a common rat poison. Perhaps cyanide derivative. The label is a deception." He straightened. "The link. Mismatched poison and label. The forge. Suicide victims do not stage false evidence after death. Someone placed this vial post-mortem to suggest self-destruction. The chain. Recall the case of the speckled band. There, too, a poison was disguised. The adder venom hidden behind a bell pull and saucer of milk. The criminal believed the distraction unbreakable. Yet the chain snapped when I connected the doctor's habits to the serpent's training. Therefore, this man did not take his own life. He was murdered, and the scene arranged. The link forges strong, Watson. Did you see it form before I spoke?" Lestrade rubbed his chin. "But the compartment was locked from the inside, Holmes. Windows sealed, no sign of struggle. How could anyone enter or leave?" Holmes's eyes shone. "That is the second link we shall pursue." We stepped out to the sideline train, in rain drumming steadily on the metal roof. The compartment smelled of polished leather upholstery and stale cigar smoke, the air cool and slightly draughty. Holmes crawled along the floor, knees pressing into the rough carpet pile, and rose with a speck of reddish clay mixed with chalk on his fingertips. "Chalk pits near Cambridge," he murmured. "Not London soil. Someone boarded elsewhere." He turned to me. "What chain would you build from these two observations? Dear reader, the false poison and the foreign mud." Before Holmes explains further, what does this evidence tell you? Evening returned us to Baker Street. The fire roared warmly, chasing the chill from our bones. Mrs. Hudson brought hot tea, bitter on the tongue, and later a measure of sweet brandy that glowed in the glass. Holmes reached into the Persian slipper for fresh tobacco, the pungent aroma filling the room once more. "The professor carried something valuable," he said quietly, drawing on his pipe. "A relic, perhaps, an artifact of great worth. Murder for gain, staged as despair. The first link forged. The chain begins." Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The next morning, the fog still lay thick over Baker Street, muting the clatter of hansom cabs and carrying the ever-present smell of coal smoke and wet stone. I woke to the familiar sound of Holmes pacing the sitting-room floorboards, his footsteps quick and restless, punctuated now and then by the soft twang of violin strings. The coal fire had been freshly stoked by Mrs. Hudson. Its warmth pushed back the chill that seeped through the window frames, and the air held the comforting aroma of strong tea brewing on the spirit lamp. Holmes was already dressed, pipe in hand, the sweetish tobacco smoke drifting lazily toward the ceiling. "We begin forging connections today, Watson," he said without preamble. "First the Langham Hotel, Blackwood's London lodgings, then the British Museum. After that, Cambridge itself if the trail demands it." We stepped out into the damp morning. The bitter fog clung to our coats like wet wool, and the rough texture of the cobblestones pressed up through our boots as we hailed a cab. The horse's harness leather smelled sharply of oil and sweat. The cab jolted forward with a rattle of wheels that echoed off the buildings. At the Langham Hotel, the marble lobby rang with the click of shoes and the low murmur of guests. Then the manager, Mr. Hargrove, a stout man with a voice like gravel dragged over iron, led us upstairs. The corridor smelled faintly of cigar smoke and carbolic polish. Blackwood's suite was tidy but impersonal, velvet curtains heavy with dust, a desk littered with papers. Holmes went straight to the wastebasket and lifted a crumpled telegram, the paper rough and slightly damp from spilled ink. He read aloud, "Urgent. Relic sale must proceed at once. E." E for his wife, no doubt, he murmured. "Pay a link." She knew the value of whatever he carried. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. He met a gentleman here 2 evenings ago, tall, bearded, foreign accent. They spoke in low tones, something about an antiquity. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Describe the man's coat. Dark tweed, mud on the hem, reddish like clay. Holmes nodded once. The same clay we found in the compartment. Did you notice that connection, dear reader? The mud links London to Cambridge before we even leave the city. We left the hotel and took another cab to the British Museum. The journey was cold. Rain began to fall in earnest, drumming on the cab roof and chilling our hands through our gloves. Inside the great reading room, the air was thick with the musty smell of old books and leather bindings. Footsteps echoed off the high ceiling like distant thunder. Dr. Elias Thorne, the curator of classical antiquities, received us in his private office. His hands were ink-stained, rough from years of handling fragile objects, and his voice was smooth and measured. Professor Blackwood consulted me last week about a Roman amulet, Thorne said. Gold, late imperial period, inscribed with protective curses, or so he claimed. He believed it had been recently excavated near Cambridge. We disagreed over provenance. He wished to sell it privately. I urged museum acquisition. Holmes leaned forward. You argued, warmly, but I never left London. Thorne's eyes flickered. He said rivals were circling, one in particular, Dr. Victor Langford. Holmes noted a speck of chalk dust on the cuff of Thorne's sleeve. Chalk dust, fresh. Thorne brushed at it hastily. From handling specimens, naturally. The link was there, subtle but unmistakable. Watson missed it at first. Did you spot how the chalk connects the curator to the train compartment mud? That by early afternoon, we were aboard the Cambridge Express. The carriage swayed gently, wheels clacking rhythmically over the tracks, the compartment warm with the smell of hot metal and coal drifting in through the vents. The leather seats were smooth and slightly sticky under our palms from the heat. Outside, the fog thinned into open fields, but the sky remained heavy and grey. At Cambridge Station, the platform was slick with rain, the air sharp with chalk dust and wet grass. We took a local fly to the Blackwood residence, a tall Gothic house on the edge of the town, its stone walls damp and dark. Lady Blackwood received us in the drawing room. A coal fire roared in the grate, throwing warmth across the Persian carpet and chasing the chill from our fingers. She wore deep mourning silk that rustled softly. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a silver pot. The tea was hot and bitter on the tongue, cutting through the lingering taste of tobacco from Holmes's pipe. Edmund was troubled these past months, she said in a low voice. He spoke of threats. Anonymous notes, shadows at the window, the amulet. He believed it would secure our future. He carried it with him to London. For a private buyer. Holmes studied the small gold pendant she wore at her throat, an almost exact miniature of the described relic. You have a similar piece? A copy he had made years ago. For luck, Amy said. Her eyes filled. He never returned. A servant entered with a fresh telegram on a tray. Holmes opened it. Sale confirmed for tomorrow evening. Meet as arranged. VL. VL, Holmes repeated softly. Victor Langford, I presume. We pressed on to interview Dr. Langford at his college rooms. His study smelled strongly of pipe tobacco and old vellum. The fire crackled. The air was pleasantly warm against the damp evening outside. Bit Langford was a large man with a booming voice that filled the small space. Blackwood was a fool, he declared. He stole my research on that amulet, years of my work. I confronted him, yes, but I never left Cambridge yesterday. Holmes bent to examine a pair of boots by the hearth. Chalk dust clung to the soles, fresh and unmistakable. Yet your boots tell a different story. Train soot on the laces as well. Langford's face darkened. Coincidence. As darkness fell, we returned to London by the last express. The carriage windows rattled, rain streaking the glass in cold rivulets. At 221B, the fire welcomed us back with a cheerful crackle. Holmes paced before it, pipe smoke curling around him like fog. Suspects multiply. The wife with her urgent telegrams, the curator with his chalk dust and arguments, the rival professor with mud on his boots, and this mysterious VL buyer. The bearded foreigner at the Langham may be the go-between. He paused, eyes gleaming. Links are forging, Watson. The chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows. The third day dawned colder still, with fog so dense it muffled even the sharpest sounds of Baker Street. Coal smoke hung low over the rooftops, blending with the damp, earthy smell of the river that drifted in whenever a window was opened. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, the fire crackling brightly in the grate, its warmth a welcome contrast to the chill that had settled in my bones during the night. The strong aroma of a freshly brewed coffee filled the room, bitter on the tongue when I took my first sip, and the rough linen napkin felt cool against my fingers as I unfolded it. Holmes was restless, pacing before the hearth with his pipe clenched between his teeth. The sweetish tobacco smoke curled upward, mingling with the faint scent of carbolic from Mrs. Hudson's morning cleaning downstairs. "We must return to the train, Watson," he said. "The compartment holds more than we first perceived. Surface observations are never enough. We must dig deeper." We took a hansom cab to King's Cross. The wheels rattled over wet cobblestones, the horse's breath steaming in the bitter air, and the leather upholstery inside the cab was cold and slightly sticky from the damp. Big Ben tolled 10 o'clock as we arrived, its deep boom rolling through the fog like a warning. The station platform still smelled of hot metal, coal dust, and the underlying rot of river mud tracked in on countless boots. Inspector Lestrade waited beside the side-lined Cambridge Express, his greatcoat damp and heavy, a faint trace of gunpowder about him, as always. "Found nothing new since yesterday," he grumbled, but Holmes was already climbing the steps into the first-class carriage. The compartment felt colder than before, the air stale with lingering traces of polished leather and old cigar smoke. Rain tapped steadily on the metal roof, a soft, persistent rhythm that echoed inside the narrow space. Holmes knelt at once on the rough carpet, his magnifying glass catching the weak gaslight. He examined the floor inch by inch, then paused. "A single hair," he said, lifting it carefully between thumb and forefinger. It was long, blonde, and carried the faint scent of lavender water. Not Blackwood's. His was dark and coarse. "This is fine. Feminine." He rose and moved to the seat opposite. Under the cushion, he found something small and round, a mother-of-pearl button, the kind used on ladies' gloves. It felt smooth and cool in his palm. Torn off in a struggle, perhaps. The thread is still attached, silk expensive. Lestrade snorted. Could belong to any previous passenger. The train's been running for days. Holmes ignored him. He opened Blackwood's overcoat, which had been left folded on the seat. In an inner pocket, carefully concealed behind a lining seam, lay the Roman amulet, gold, heavy, its surface inscribed with tiny Latin curses. The metal was cold to the touch, almost icy, and the chain that once held it was broken, several small links scattered loose in the pocket like dropped clues. "The amulet itself," Holmes murmured. He didn't trust it to the luggage van. He carried it on his person, yet someone knew it was there. He turned the broken chain in his fingers. The link, blonde hair, mother-of-pearl button, and the concealed relic. The forge. These are not random traces. The hair suggests a woman's presence. The button indicates physical contact, likely violent. The amulet explains motive, greed for a priceless antiquity. Someone entered this locked compartment, struggled briefly, administered poison, arranged the suicide scene with the false vial. They then departed, leaving these fragments behind. He straightened, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light. The chain. Recall the adventure of the naval treaty. There, too, a locked room baffled us at first, but when I connected the smudge on the carpet to the charwoman's muddy boots, and the missing page to the clerk's desperate need for money, the chain formed unbreakable. The criminal had used a child to pass documents through a window. Yet the mud betrayed the entry point. Here, similarly, the locked door misleads only until we link the physical traces to human action. Therefore, the murderer was known to Blackwood, close enough for trust, yet ruthless enough to kill. The chain grows, Watson. Logic binds tighter with every link. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold compartment. But how did they leave a locked room? That, Holmes said, is the next link we shall forge. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist. Footsteps hurried along the platform. Porters, when passengers, police, and a distant foghorn moaned from the Thames like a lost soul. Holmes pocketed the hair, the button, and a small fragment of the broken chain. The cold metal links clinked softly in his hand. Back at 221B that evening, the fire roared high, its crackle a cheerful counterpoint to the patter of rain against the windows. Mrs. Hudson brought hot soup, its savoury steam rising in curls, and later a glass of sweet brandy that warmed my throat after the day's chill. Holmes sat with his pipe, the Persian slipper open beside him, tobacco pungent in the warm air. He spread the evidence on the table. The blonde hair, the button, the amulet. Lady Blackwood is blonde, he said quietly. She wears lavender. Yet her telegram places her in Cambridge, at the time of death. An accomplice, perhaps, or someone imitating her presence. He leaned back, steepled fingers under his chin. The chain grows stronger with each connection. The false poison linked to the mud on the boots, the mud to Cambridge, the amulet to motive, now hair and button to intimate contact. What chain would you build next, dear reader? Before Holmes reveals more, how many of these links did you spot yourself? The violin came out later, its strings singing softly in the firelight. Holmes played a slow, thoughtful air while I watched the flames dance. The mystery deepened, but the logic was tightening. The chain grows stronger. Logic binds. Chapter 4. Testing the links. The fourth morning brought a brief respite from the fog. A pale sun struggled through the haze over Baker Street, but the air remained sharp with coal smoke and the damp chill of approaching winter. I woke to the now familiar sound of Holmes moving restlessly about the sitting room, the fire already crackling brightly and filling the space with welcome warmth. The smell of strong coffee mingled with the sweetish tobacco from his pipe as he stood by the window, and steepled fingers under his chin, staring down at the street where hansom cabs clattered past on the still wet cobbles. "We test the links today, Watson," he said without turning. "Some will hold firm, others will shatter under pressure. Only the true chain will survive." Our first visit was to a small pawn shop in Whitechapel, where Lady Blackwood had sent one of her urgent telegrams. The narrow street outside smelled of wet brick, horse manure, and the faint metallic tang of forge smoke from nearby workshops. Inside, the shop was dim, lit by a single gas jet that hissed softly overhead. Shelves groaned under the weight of tarnished silver and worn leather goods. The air carried the musty odor of old cloth and carbolic disinfectant. The pawnbroker, a thin man named Reuben Moss, with a voice like dry leaves scraping together, peered at us over half-moon spectacles. "Lady Blackwood? Aye, she came in 3 days past," he said, pulling a ledger across the scarred counter. The rough paper felt gritty under my fingers as I leaned in. "Sold a pair of pearl earrings and a gold locket. Needed quick money," she said. "No mention of any Roman trinket." Holmes examined the entry, then the pawnbroker's hands, rough, ink-stained, but free of chalk dust. "She pawned jewelry, but kept the amulet secret, a weak link in her story of desperation, yet it does not break the chain entirely." We left the shop and took another cab. The leather seats, cold against our backs, the journey rattling through crowded streets where rain began again, pattering on the roof like impatient fingers. Our next stop was a public house near Cambridge Station, where Dr. Victor Langford claimed to have spent the entire day of the murder. The pub smelled strongly of ale, pipe smoke, and the yeasty warmth of a coal fire roaring in the corner grate. The landlord, a burly man with a booming laugh, wiped his hands on a stained apron. Dr. Langford, here from noon till closing, sir, sat by the fire reading his papers. Half a dozen regulars saw him. He gestured to a group at the bar, who nodded confirmation. Yet one man, a thin clerk with nervous eyes, hesitated when Holmes questioned him directly. "You saw him leave briefly?" Holmes asked quietly. The clerk swallowed. Only to the yard for a moment. Back quick, though." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A moment is enough to board a train if one knows the timetable. The alibi holds, mostly. But the link frays at the edges." We pressed on to Mr. Samuel Croft's office near the Strand. The room was small and overheated, smelling of fresh ink, sealing wax, and a faint trace of gunpowder that made Holmes pause. Croft, a stout man with a gruff voice, spread his ledgers on the desk. The paper was crisp and new under my touch as I scanned the columns. "Blackwood owed me £3,000, Croft said. "Desperate man. But I was here all day. Witnesses in the outer office." Holmes bent over the ledger. "This entry, the repayment date, is in fresh ink. The rest has faded slightly. Forged recently?" Croft flushed. "Nonsense." Yet the discrepancy was clear. The financial motive link shattered under close scrutiny. Croft's books had been altered after the fact. By late afternoon, we traced the mysterious bearded foreigner from the Langham Hotel register to a lodging house in Bloomsbury. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. The landlady's voice was sharp as she led us upstairs. The man, Herr Victor Lehmann, was packing a valise when we entered. He was tall, heavily bearded, with an accent thick as Prussian fog. "Professor Blackwood approached me about selling an antiquity," he admitted, hands raised. "I am but a broker. I never saw him on the train. I was in London." Holmes examined Lehmann's coat. Dark tweed, mud on the hem, but no chalk dust, no train soot. "Yet you are a link in the chain of sale, but not of murder. Your presence misleads only those who chase shadows." Our final call was back to Dr. Elias Thorne at the British Museum. The great reading room echoed with soft footsteps and the rustle of turning pages. The air was cool and thick with the scent of old vellum and dust. Thorne met us in a side corridor, his hands clasped behind his back. "I argued with Blackwood over the amulet's ownership," he said calmly. "But I never left these walls yesterday. My movements are logged." Holmes pointed to a faint chalk mark on Thorne's sleeve, faded now, but matching the compartment dust. "Yet this chalk is from the Cambridge pits, not museum specimens." Thorne paled. "I visited a colleague there last week." Holmes nodded. "Your timeline holds. The link remains intact, though weakened." As evening fell, we returned to Baker Street. The fog had thickened again. They're carrying the damp smell of the river and the distant moan of foghorns. Inside 221B, the fire roared, its heat welcome after the day's cold journeys. Mrs. Hudson brought hot tea, bitter and reviving, and a measure of sweet brandy that glowed in the lamplight. Holmes paced slowly before the hearth, pipe smoke curling around him. "We tested 5 links today," he said quietly. "Lady Blackwood's pawned jewels, weak but not broken. Langford's alibi, frayed at the edges. Croft's ledger, shattered entirely. A red herring. Lehmann the broker, peripheral. Thorne's chalk dust. Holds, but does not point to him alone." He stopped, eyes gleaming. "The false trails fall away. The true chain emerges clearer now." pointing not outward to strangers, but inward to those closest to the professor. What chain would you build from these broken and surviving links, dear reader? Holmes saw which ones held firm. How many did you spot as false before he tested them? The true chain emerges. But Chapter 5. The chain tightens. By the 5th day, the fog had lifted slightly, but a raw wind swept through London, carrying the sharp, briny smell of the Thames and the ever-present bite of coal smoke. I rose early at 2:21 to find Holmes already dressed and standing by the window, pipe in hand, watching the street below, where hansom cabs splashed through shallow puddles. The sitting room was warm from the freshly stoked fire. Its crackle mingled with the distant toll of Big Ben and the rhythmic clop of hooves on wet cobblestones. The air held the comforting aroma of strong coffee and the faint, sweetish trace of Holmes's tobacco. "A telegram arrived at dawn," he said, without turning. "From our bearded friend, Layman. He claims to have seen Dr. Langford at King's Cross on the morning of the murder, disguised but unmistakable. The chain tightens, Watson. Today, we confront the quarry." We hurried downstairs and into a waiting cab. The leather seats were cold and damp. The journey to Cambridge rattled with urgency, wheels thundering over points as the train gathered speed. Outside the window, fields blurred past under a low grey sky, rain streaking the glass in cold rivulets. Inside the compartment, the air smelled of hot metal and coal drifting through the vents. The leather upholstery grew warm against our backs as the locomotive laboured. At Cambridge Station, we hired a fly. The horse's breath steamed in the chill air. Its harness leather creaked with every jolt along the muddy lanes. We drove straight to Dr. Victor Langford's college rooms. The quadrangle echoed with our footsteps on slick flagstones. A faint smell of wet stone and old books hung in the air. Langford's door was ajar. Inside, the study was in disarray. Papers scattered across the desk, drawers half pulled, the fire low in the grate. Langford stood at the window, back to us, shoulders rigid. He turned slowly when Holmes spoke his name. His face was flushed, eyes darting. "You knew we were coming," Holmes said quietly. "Yet you did not flee. Bold or foolish?" Langford's voice was hoarse. "I have nothing to hide." Holmes stepped forward, holding up the blonde hair we had found in the compartment. "This was on the seat beside the body. Lavender scented. Your wife is blonde, is she not? And she wears lavender water." Langford's hand twitched toward his pocket. Holmes moved faster. His long fingers closed around the man's wrist. A small glass vial slipped to the floor and rolled across the carpet. Holmes retrieved it carefully. The label read, "Arsenic pure," identical to the one clutched in Blackwood's dead hand. "The same deception," Holmes murmured, "but we know better now." Langford lunged suddenly, shoving past me toward the door. I stumbled against the desk. Papers fluttered like startled birds. Holmes was quicker. He seized Langford's coattail and yanked him back. The struggle was brief but fierce. Boots scuffed on the rug, a chair overturned with a crash, the fire flaring as coals scattered. Langford's breath came in harsh gasps, smelling faintly of brandy. "Enough!" Holmes commanded, pinning the larger man against the wall with surprising strength. "The game ends here." I righted the chair, heart pounding. Then while Holmes searched Langford's pockets, he produced a ticket stub, first-class London to Cambridge, dated the day of the murder, and a torn scrap of mother-of-pearl from a glove button. "The crucial link," Holmes said, holding the stub to the light. "You boarded at an intermediate stop, disguised perhaps as a porter or passenger. You entered the compartment. Blackwood trusted you as a colleague. You offered a shared brandy to steady his nerves before the sale. The drink masked the bitter taste of the poison you slipped in. When he collapsed, you arranged the false vial, locked the door from inside, using a simple string trick through the window, a child's ruse, but effective in a fog-bound train, and slipped away at the next halt." Langford sagged, the fight draining from him. He was going to expose me. My forgeries, the amulet was mine by right, years of work. He would have ruined me. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The link, the ticket stub and button fragment in your possession. The forge. They connect directly to the compartment traces we found earlier, the hair from your wife's glove, planted to mislead, the poison residue matching your laboratory stock. The chain. Recall the Hound of the Baskervilles, where phosphorescent paint forged a spectral terror to drive a man to his death. The criminal believed the legend unbreakable. Yet I linked the paint to the Hound's training, the boot prints to the moor, and the motive to inheritance. The chain of deception snapped under simple observation. Here, too, greed forged a false suicide, but physical traces. Remember every step. He turned to me. The breakthrough, Watson. No locked room is truly impenetrable when logic traces the entry and exit. Langford slumped into the chair, head in hands. Outside, rain began again, drumming on the window panes like a judge's gavel. The fire crackled low, its warmth fading as the room grew colder. Holmes straightened his coat. "You will come with us to Scotland Yard. The chain tightens around you now. No escape remains." As we led Langford out into the quadrangle, his footsteps dragged on the wet stones. A distant foghorn moaned from the river, mournful and final. The wind carried the sharp scent of chalk dust and rain-soaked earth, the same earth that had betrayed him from the beginning. What does this confrontation tell you, dear reader? Before the final links are forged, did you see the string trick and the shared brandy as the means of entry? Holmes saw them clearly. How many connections did you make? The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the past. The sixth day found us back in London, under a sky heavy with low clouds that promised more rain. The fog had returned in patches, drifting through the streets like smoke from 1,000 chimneys, carrying the familiar mingled scents of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint, brackish rot of the river. At 221B Baker Street, the sitting room was warm and welcoming. The coal fire roared steadily in the grate, its crackle a steady counterpoint to the patter of rain against the window panes. Mrs. Hudson had just brought up a tray of hot tea, bitter and strong, steaming in the porcelain cups, and a plate of buttered toast whose rough texture felt comforting under my fingers after the long journey from Cambridge. Holmes sat at the table, with a pile of documents spread before him. Letters, ledgers, university records, and a thin file of newspaper clippings he had requested from his index. His pipe sent up slow curls of sweetish tobacco smoke that mingled with the fire's warmth. His eyes, bright with that peculiar light, moved rapidly over the pages. "The criminal's history is the deepest link, Watson," he said quietly. "Motive is never born in a vacuum. It grows from seeds planted years before. We must trace Langford's past to understand why Blackwood had to die." We began with the university archives, delivered by special messenger that morning. The envelopes were sealed with red wax, the paper crisp and slightly yellowed at the edges. Holmes slit them open, one by one. The first was a series of correspondence between Langford and Blackwood, dating back 8 years. Polite at first, then increasingly strained. Blackwood had accused Langford of borrowing research notes on Roman provincial cults without proper citation. Langford had replied with cold denials, but the tone grew sharper with each exchange. Holmes tapped a letter dated 4 years earlier. "Here." Blackwood discovered Langford had sold a forged Etruscan bronze to a private collector. The piece was later exposed as a modern copy. Langford's reputation was damaged, but Blackwood kept silent, out of collegial loyalty perhaps, or because he lacked proof at the time. The next document was a ledger page from a Cambridge antiquities dealer. Rough paper, ink faded in places, but the entries clear. Payments to V. Langford for restored Roman gold amulet over 3 separate dates. The amounts were substantial. Holmes compared them to the description of the amulet found in Blackwood's pocket. "The same piece," he murmured. "Langford forged it, or had it forged, and passed it as genuine." Blackwood, with his deeper knowledge of imperial inscriptions, recognized the fraud when Langford tried to sell it through him. That was the breaking point. Blackwood threatened exposure unless Langford confessed publicly and returned the money. I sipped my tea, its heat chasing the chill from my hands. So the motive was not mere greed, it was self-preservation. Precisely. Ruin of career, loss of position, possible criminal charges. Langford could not allow it. We turned next to the amulet itself, which Holmes had borrowed from the police evidence locker under Lestrade's reluctant signature. He held it to the gaslight. The gold was warm now, from the fire's heat, its surface gleaming softly. The tiny Latin curses inscribed along the edge were crisp, too crisp for a piece supposedly buried for centuries. Under magnification, the tool marks were modern, the alloy slightly wrong for true Roman work. Holmes set it down carefully. Every link connects now. The blonde hair and mother-of-pearl button, planted by Langford's wife to cast suspicion elsewhere, the chalk dust on boots and cuffs, from Cambridge pits, where Langford tested his forgeries in secret workshops, the poison residue matching his laboratory stock, the ticket stub and torn button fragment found on his person, and the amulet, his own creation, the object that would have exposed him. He leaned back, steepled fingers under his chin. The chain. Recall the Valley of Fear? Ned wear a coal company tattoo linked a murdered man to an American secret society. The past membership forged a chain through decades, connecting old oaths of silence to present murder. The criminal believed time had erased the mark, yet the body remembered. Here, too, Langford believed years of careful forgery had buried his deception. Yet Blackwood's expertise and the physical traces of the amulet itself remembered every lie. Past and present are bound by the same unbreakable chain of evidence. I felt the weight of it settle over me. Then the murder was not impulsive. It was planned long before the train journey. Exactly. Langford arranged the private sale meeting on the express, knowing the locked compartment would suggest suicide. He boarded at an intermediate stop, disguised, perhaps, as a railway official. The shared brandy was the vehicle. The poison, swift and bitter, masked by the drink's sweetness. The false vial and locked door completed the illusion. But he forgot that every step leaves traces. Mud, hair, buttons, ticket stubs. The ground remembers. Watson, the past remembers. Outside, the rain strengthened, drumming harder on the panes. A distant foghorn moaned from the river, low and mournful. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire, the carpet muffling his steps. Every link is accounted for, he said. The false poison connects to his laboratory, the mud to Cambridge, the amulet to his forgeries, the wife's traces to misdirection, the timeline to his movements. No weak link remains. He stopped, eyes gleaming. Before the final confrontation, what chain would you now see forming from these revelations of the past? Dear reader, Holmes has connected the years of deceit to the single fatal journey. Did you foresee how deeply the motive ran? The fire crackled low, sending sparks up the chimney. Holmes returned to his chair, violin in hand, and drew the bow across the strings in a slow, thoughtful phrase. The notes hung in the warm air, mingling with pipe smoke and the scent of cooling tea, past and present. One unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The complete chain. The seventh day arrived with a rare clarity in the London sky. Pale sunlight filtered through thinning fog, though the air still carried the sharp bite of coal smoke and the distant, briny dampness of the Thames. And at 221B Baker Street, the sitting room felt charged with anticipation. The coal fire burned steadily, its crackle mingling with the soft hiss of the gasogene on the sideboard and the faint clink of crystal from the tantalus. Mrs. Hudson had drawn the curtains wide, letting in the cool light that gleamed on the polished furniture and caught the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of strong coffee rose from the tray she had just brought up, and its bitterness cutting through the lingering sweetness of Holmes's tobacco. Holmes stood before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, eyes bright with the peculiar light of triumph held in check. Inspector Lestrade had arrived early with 2 constables, and Dr. Victor Langford sat in an armchair under guard, pale, silent, wrists bound loosely with thin cord. Lady Blackwood, Dr. Elias Thorne, Mr. Samuel Croft, and even the bearded broker, Herr Lehmann, had been summoned at Holmes's request. They sat in a loose semicircle, faces tense, the room heavy with unspoken questions. Holmes spoke at last, voice calm and measured, cutting through the quiet like a knife through silk. "Gentlemen, and Lady Blackwood, the chain is complete. Every link is forged, tested, and unbreakable. I shall now lay it before you, link by link, so that no doubt remains." He stepped to the center of the room, steepled fingers under his chin. First, the physical evidence links. The blonde hair found in the compartment, scented with lavender, was planted deliberately to suggest Lady Blackwood's presence. It came from one of her gloves her husband borrowed for the journey, knowing she would never board the train. The mother-of-pearl button, torn from the same glove, confirms intimate contact. The chalk dust on boots and cuffs traces directly to the Cambridge pits, where Langford maintained a secret workshop for his forgeries. The poison residue on the lips, bitter, almond-like, not true arsenic, matches the stock in Langford's private laboratory at the college. The false vial, labelled arsenic pure, was taken from the same stock and placed in the dead man's hand after death. These are not coincidences. They are deliberate traces left by one man. Langford shifted in his chair. The cord creaked softly. Next, the timeline links. Blackwood boarded the Cambridge Express at King's Cross at 6:45 p.m. The train made one intermediate stop at Hitchin at 7:32 p.m. A brief halt of 4 minutes. Langford purchased a first-class ticket for that very stop. The stub was found in his pocket. He boarded disguised as a railway inspector. Cap low, coat borrowed from the porter's room. He entered Blackwood's compartment under pretext of checking tickets. The door was locked from inside after he left by means of a simple string passed through the window frame, a trick he had used before in college pranks. He disembarked at Hitchin before the train continued, returning to Cambridge by a later local service. The timetable confirms it. The mud on his boots confirms the location. Lady Blackwood gave a small, stifled sound. Thorne stared at the carpet. Witness links. Herr Lehmann here confirms Langford approached him weeks earlier to arrange a private buyer for the amulet, yet Lehmann never met Blackwood on the train. The pawnshop records show Lady Blackwood sold jewellery for cash, but never mentioned the relic, because her husband kept its existence secret from her until the last. Mr. Croft's forged ledger entries attempted to inflate Blackwood's debts as motive, but the ink freshness betrayed the alteration. Only Langford had access to Blackwood's private laboratory notes and the means to mimic his handwriting. Croft flushed dark red. Lestrade made a low note in his notebook. Motive links. Langford forged the Roman amulet over years, passing it as genuine to collectors. Blackwood, with his expertise in imperial inscriptions, recognized the modern tool marks and incorrect alloy when Langford attempted to sell it through him. Blackwood confronted him privately, demanding confession and restitution. Exposure would have ended Langford's career, stripped him of his fellowship, and invited criminal prosecution. The sale on the Express was the final meeting, Langford's last chance to silence the threat. Langford's head dropped. A low groan escaped him. Finally. The connecting link, the amulet itself, found concealed in Blackwood's inner pocket, its chain broken in the struggle. The tiny curse inscriptions are too precise, too fresh. Langford's own handiwork. Blackwood carried it to prove the forgery to the buyer. Langford killed him to reclaim it and preserve his secret. He overlooked one detail. The ground beneath the train remembers every step, and the body remembers every lie. Holmes paused, letting silence settle. The fire crackled, and a distant hansom cab rattled past below. Every link accounted for: the false poison to the laboratory, the mud to Cambridge, the hair and button to misdirection, the ticket to the timeline, the amulet to the motive. No thread remains loose. He turned to Langford. You administered the poison in a shared glass of brandy, its sweetness masking the bitter taste. You arranged the suicide scene, locked the door, and vanished. But observation defeats deception, Dr. Langford. The chain is complete. Langford looked up, eyes hollow. I never meant it to end like this. He would have destroyed me. Lestrade rose. Victor Langford, I arrest you for the murder of Professor Edmund Blackwood. The constables stepped forward. The cords tightened. Lady Blackwood wept quietly into her handkerchief. Thorne and Croft exchanged stunned glances. Lehman simply nodded once, as if a long suspicion had been confirmed. Holmes returned to the hearth, drawing upon his pipe, and the smoke curled upward in slow spirals. The criminal exposed. Every link accounted for. The chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. The 8th day broke cold and clear over London. The fog finally lifted to reveal a pale winter sun that cast long shadows across the streets. Yet the air remained sharp with coal smoke, the faint metallic tang of frost on iron railings, and the ever-present damp rot rising from the Thames. At King's Cross Station, the platform bustled with morning travellers. The hansom cabs clattered up to the entrance, their wheels grinding on wet cobblestones, while porters shouted and steam engines hissed like impatient dragons. The scent of hot oil from the locomotives mingled with the yeasty warmth of a nearby coffee stall. Inspector Lestrade had arranged the arrest to take place discreetly on the same platform where the Cambridge Express had stood silent days earlier. 2 constables flanked Dr. Victor Langford as he was led from a closed police van. His hands were manacled now, the cold iron cuffs clinking softly with each reluctant step. His overcoat hung loosely on his frame. The once imposing figure seemed diminished, face ashen beneath the brim of his hat. The wind carried the distant moan of a foghorn even though the fog had gone, a lingering echo of the crime. Holmes and I stood a little apart near the sidelined carriage that still bore faint chalk dust on its steps. Lestrade approached us first, rubbing his gloved hands together against the chill. "He'll make a full statement at the Yard," Lestrade said gruffly. "Already admitted the poison came from his own laboratory, said he never intended murder, only to incapacitate Blackwood long enough to take the amulet. Panic set in when the man stopped breathing." Langford's eyes met Holmes's across the platform. For a moment the murderer's gaze burned with something close to hatred. Then it dulled into resignation. He spoke, in voice low but carrying in the crisp air. "You think you've won, Holmes, but you've only exposed what men like me have always known. Knowledge is power, and power corrupts. Blackwood would have destroyed everything I built." Holmes drew upon his pipe, the sweetish smoke curling upward in the cold. "Knowledge without honor corrupts absolutely, Dr. Langford. Your forgeries were clever, your deception meticulous, but you forgot the oldest truth. The earth remembers every footprint, and truth remembers every lie." Langford's shoulders sagged. One of the constables gave a gentle tug on the chain. The metal links clinked again. A small, final sound. Langford allowed himself to be led toward the waiting police carriage. As he passed the sideline train, he paused, staring at the compartment door. For an instant, his face twisted. Regret, perhaps, or simply the shock of seeing the scene of his crime in daylight. Lady Blackwood had been permitted to attend under police escort. She stood some distance away, veiled in black, gloved hands, clasped tightly. When Langford was led past, she turned her face away, but not before I saw the glint of tears beneath the veil. Dr. Thorne and Mr. Croft had also come. Witnesses now rather than suspects. Thorne's expression was one of quiet relief. Croft looked merely embarrassed, as though the whole affair had been an inconvenience to his business. Lestrade cleared his throat. There are loose ends, Holmes, but minor ones. The wife knew nothing of the amulet's true nature, only that her husband carried something valuable. She sold jewelry to pay debts he never told her about. We've cleared her completely. Thorne's chalk dust was from a legitimate visit to the pits weeks earlier. His argument with Blackwood was academic, not murderous. Croft's ledger forgery was clumsy self-protection. He feared being implicated in Blackwood's debts. He'll face charges for falsifying documents. Yet, but nothing more. Holmes nodded once. The chain holds only the guilty. The innocent links were tested and found sound. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Porters, passengers, a few newspapermen with notebooks ready. One of them called out a question. Lestrade waved him off with an impatient gesture. The constables helped Langford into the police carriage. The door closed with a solid thud. The driver cracked his whip, and the vehicle rolled away, their wheels rumbling over the cobbles until the sound faded into the general station din. Holmes turned to me, eyes still bright, but now tempered with quiet satisfaction. The criminal is bound, Watson, not merely by iron, but by the logic that forged every link. Scotland Yard will take the credit in the papers, as they should, but we know the truth. Observation defeated deception once again. We walked slowly back toward the cab rank. The wind nipped at our faces. My boots crunched on scattered gravel. Big Ben tolled the hour in the distance, its deep boom rolling across the city like a solemn pronouncement. Inside the hansom, the leather seats were cold at first, then warmed by our bodies as we settled in. Holmes drew his coat closer and lit his pipe again, the match flaring briefly in the dim interior. Lady Blackwood will recover her husband's reputation, he said quietly. The amulet will go to the British Museum, properly authenticated this time. Thorne has already offered to catalogue it. The forgeries Langford sold over the years will be quietly recalled where possible. Justice, in its slow Victorian way, will be served. I nodded, watching the streets pass outside the window. Gas lamps still flickering in the early light, shopkeepers raising shutters, the city waking as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. A man's life had ended in deceit. Another's would end behind bars. The chain had done its work. As the cab turned into Baker Street, the familiar sight of 221B came into view. The windows glowed warmly. Smoke rose straight from the chimney in the still air. Mrs. Hudson would have the fire going, tea waiting, the sitting room ready for reflection. The criminal bound. Justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The 9th day dawned with a brittle clarity that seemed almost unnatural after weeks of fog and rain. The London sky stretched pale and high above Baker Street. In the air carried a crisp bite, sharpened by the lingering scent of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys and the clean, frosty edge of approaching winter. At 221B, the sitting room felt brighter than usual. Mrs. Hudson had opened the windows briefly to air the room. Faint draughts stirred the curtains, bringing in the distant clatter of hansom cabs on dry cobbles and the sharp ring of a newsboy's call. The coal fire burned low but steady, its warmth gentle against the morning chill, and the aroma of fresh-baked bread drifted up from the kitchen below. I sat at the breakfast table with the morning papers spread before me. The headlines had shifted at last. Cambridge professor's murder solved. Arrest at King's Cross dominated the front pages, though the accounts credited Scotland Yard almost exclusively. A smaller article in the Times noted the forthcoming inquest and the expected transfer of the Roman amulet to the British Museum. Holmes lounged in his armchair opposite, a pipe in hand, the sweetish tobacco smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. His expression was calm, almost serene. The restless energy of the chase replaced by quiet satisfaction. "The legal machinery turns slowly, Watson," he remarked. "But it turns. Today we see the innocent links restored to their proper places." The first piece of resolution came by special messenger before noon. A thick envelope from the coroner's office contained the preliminary findings of the inquest. It was scheduled for the following week. Langford's full confession, extracted at Scotland Yard the previous evening, had removed any need for prolonged proceedings. He had admitted everything. The years of forging antiquities, the confrontation with Blackwood, the plan to silence him on the train, the poison in the brandy, the string trick at the window. The document was signed in a trembling hand. The ink had smudged slightly where a drop of moisture, perhaps a tear, had fallen. In Lady Blackwood, arrived shortly after luncheon, she was shown up by Mrs. Hudson, who hovered protectively for a moment before withdrawing. The widow wore deep mourning, but her veil was lifted. Her face, though pale, carried a measure of composure that had been absent during our earlier meetings. She accepted a chair near the fire, gloved hands folded in her lap. "Mr. Holmes," she began, voice low but steady, "the coroner has released Edmund's body for burial. The service will be private, in Cambridge, next Tuesday. I wished to thank you personally. Without your work, the stain of suicide would have followed him forever." Holmes inclined his head. "The truth restores honor where deception had stolen it, Lady Blackwood. Your husband died defending integrity, his own, and that of scholarship. The amulet will bear his name in the museum catalogue as the man who recognized its falsity." She drew a small breath. They have offered me a position as honorary consultant for the classical collection. Not wealth, but purpose. It is more than I expected." We spoke quietly for half an hour. She described the future she now envisioned, returning to their Cambridge home, resuming her own studies in Roman epigraphy, perhaps even publishing Edmund's unfinished monograph on provincial cults. The shadow of suspicion had lifted from her completely. But Scotland Yard had issued a formal statement exonerating her of any involvement. As she rose to leave, she pressed Holmes's hand briefly. "You gave me back my husband's memory," she said simply. "That is worth more than any relic." After she departed, the room felt quieter. The fire's crackle more pronounced. Holmes refilled his pipe from the Persian slipper, the pungent tobacco scent blooming anew. Dr. Elias Thorne visited next, late in the afternoon. He carried a slim portfolio under his arm, preliminary notes for the amulet's display card. The curator looked older than when we had first met him, but relief had softened the lines around his eyes. "The museum trustees have voted unanimously to accept the piece," he told us, voice warm with satisfaction. "It will be exhibited with full provenance. Recognized as forgery by Professor Edmund Blackwood, 1892. Recovered, following investigation, by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Your name will appear beside his, sir." Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Credit belongs to observation, not to me. But I am glad the object will serve its proper purpose, to educate, not to deceive." Thorne left with a promise to send complimentary tickets for the opening. Mr. Samuel Croft sent only a brief note by messenger. Formal thanks for clearing his name of murder suspicion, coupled with an apology for the forged ledger entries. He would face a minor fine for falsification of documents, but no jail time. His business, though bruised, would survive. As evening fell, the city outside began to settle into its familiar rhythm. Gas lamps flickered to life along Baker Street, their soft yellow glow pushing back the early dusk. Big Ben tolled 6 times in the distance, its deep notes rolling across rooftops. Inside 221B, Mrs. Hudson brought up a simple supper, hot mutton broth, whose savory steam filled the room. The bread still warm from the oven, and a decanter of sweet sherry that glowed ruby in the firelight. Holmes and I sat in companionable silence for a time. The papers lay folded now. The documents of the case had been tied into neat bundles and set aside. The chain had done its work, not only to bind the guilty, but to release the innocent. London was returning to normal. Hansom cabs clattered past below, their wheels steady on dry cobbles. Shop windows shone with evening trade. In the foghorns on the river sounded fainter, almost nostalgic. The stain of murder had been scrubbed away by logic. Order had been restored to the streets and to the lives it had touched. The fire burned lower, casting long shadows across the carpet. Holmes drew upon his pipe once more, eyes half closed in reflection. "Another case closed," he murmured. "Another chain forged and then set aside. The city moves on, as it always does." I raised my glass in quiet salute. The sherry was sweet on the tongue, warm against the evening chill. Order restored to London streets. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. The case of the Cambridge Express had been closed for nearly a fortnight, yet its echoes lingered pleasantly in the quiet evenings at 221B Baker Street. On this particular night, in late autumn, the fog had returned in gentle swaths, softening the gas lamps outside and muffling the clatter of late hansom cabs on the cobbles below. Inside our sitting room, the coal fire burned with a steady, cheerful crackle, its warmth spreading across the worn Persian carpet and chasing the chill from every corner. The air carried the comforting, mingled scents of burning coal, strong shag tobacco from Holmes's pipe, and the faint, sweet residue of the brandy we had shared after supper. Mrs. Hudson had left us a decanter on the sideboard. Its crystal caught the firelight in small ruby sparks. Holmes lounged in his favourite armchair, the long legs stretched toward the hearth, pipe clenched between his teeth. The Stradivarius rested across his knees. Every so often he drew the bow lightly across the strings, producing a soft, meditative phrase that drifted into the quiet room like smoke. I sat opposite with my journal open on my lap, the pen still warm in my hand from the last entry. The morning papers lay folded on the table between us, headlines already faded to smaller type, and the arrest and confession reduced to a brief paragraph on an inside page. London had moved on, as it always does. "Another chain forged and set aside," Holmes murmured, setting the violin gently on the table. "Yet each one teaches something new, Watson, or reminds us of something old." I nodded, closing the journal. The papers give Lestrade most of the credit, as usual. But the truth is in the details. The links you saw when others saw only coincidence. He drew upon his pipe, in the bowl, glowing briefly in the dimness. The chain method is simple in principle, yet profound in application. Begin with the smallest, most concrete observation. The first link: a mismatched poison residue on dead lips, a speck of reddish chalk clay mud on a carpet, a single blonde hair scented with lavender. Each is meaningless alone. But when you forge connections through logic, place, time, habit, motive, the links bind into an unbreakable whole. Eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. He leaned forward slightly, eyes catching the firelight. In this case, the first link was the vial itself, labelled arsenic, yet containing a different poison altogether. That single discrepancy demanded explanation. Suicide victims do not stage false evidence. From there, the chain grew. The mud connected the compartment to Cambridge pits. The hair and button suggested misdirection. The ticket stub and laboratory stock pointed to Langford. Each new observation was tested against the others. Weak links, Croft's forged ledger, Lehman's peripheral involvement, shattered under scrutiny. The strong ones held. He paused, refilling his pipe from the Persian slipper. The pungent tobacco scent bloomed afresh. Compare it to the sign of 4. There, too, a chain began with small traces. A wooden-legged man's footprint in creosote, a child's hand in an attic window, a broken pearl from a string. Each seemed disconnected. Yet, when linked through motive, revenge for betrayal, timeline, the Andaman convict's escape, and physical evidence, the creosote trail leading to Pondicherry Lodge, the chain became unbreakable. Jonathan Small believed distance and time would protect him. The ground and the body remembered otherwise. So it was with Langford. He believed forgery and poison could erase his past. Observation resurrected it. I sipped my brandy, its sweetness warm on the tongue. You make it sound almost mechanical, yet there is art in it, the intuition that sees which link to pull next. Holmes smiled faintly. Art and science in equal measure. The science lies in relentless collection of data. Mud, hair, ink, alloy composition. The art lies in recognizing pattern where others see chaos. Deception depends on distraction. The criminal plants, red herrings, stages scenes, locks doors. But every act leaves traces. Physical, temporal, human. The trained eye follows them backward to their source. Observation defeats deception because the world cannot lie consistently. A man may forge an amulet, but he cannot forge the microscopic tool marks it bears. He may lock a door, but he cannot erase the string fiber caught in the window frame. He rose and paced slowly before the fire, the carpet muffling his steps. Why does this method succeed where others fail? Because most men reason from conclusion to evidence. They begin with guilt or innocence and bend facts to fit. I begin with facts alone and let them lead where they will. No theory is sacred, no suspect is favored. When the chain is complete, the conclusion is inevitable. Langford's guilt was not assumed, it was demonstrated. Link by forged link. The violin came into his hands again. He played a few bars of a slow air, something old and melancholy, then set the instrument aside once more. To the listener who has followed these events, he said quietly, turning toward me as though addressing an unseen audience beyond the firelight, "Take this lesson. Train your eye to see the small things. A mismatched label, a foreign speck of earth, a scent on a hair, these are not trifles. They are the first links. Forge them with logic, test them with doubt, and the chain will bind the truth. The world is full of chains waiting to be discovered. Some lead to crime, the others to innocence. Restored, all lead to understanding, if we but look." He settled back into his chair, pipe glowing softly. The fire crackled low, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, a hansom cab passed with a final rattle of wheels. Big Ben tolled 11 in the distance. I closed my journal with a quiet snap. Until the next chain forges then. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. And until the next, dear listener, the game continues.